So, welcome back to this series on sample and holds. In the first video, I wasn't sure whether this would be 2 videos or 3. I'm now confident it will be 3 videos. Today's video will focus on shift registers and sequencers and things that are kind of related to generating melodic elements, although I'll just point out sequencers and shift registers can be used for all sorts of stuff. It doesn't have to be in this context of melody generation. That's just the most common use, and that's what I'm going to demonstrate today. So today we'll focus on that. The next video, which will probably be out in about a week, there's some stuff I want to take care of before I dive into that. We'll deal with the everything else category. It's not easy to sum up. At this point, you've probably figured out that sample and holds can be used in a bunch of different ways. So everything else will be out in about a week after this video comes out, which I hope will be Tuesday or Wednesday of whatever. It'll be out about a week from now. One other piece of business is just sometimes people post off-topic questions in the comments of my videos. This came up recently. And I would just like to ask people that if you have a question that is not related to the video at hand, I mean, ask away, but I would prefer if you maybe jotted down that question and posted it later on ZOIA. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that, there's much greater visibility on ZOIA than there is for the comments of my YouTube videos. If other people are interested in the topic, they're much more likely to see it. The other one is that, it also puts me in a spot to sort of have to answer that question. And there's, other people in the ZOIA community who might chime in, but they won't chime in to a comment in my video. It's a way of, first of all, making the work that I do in answering that question maybe benefit more people, but also to allow other members of the community to participate in and elaborate on that discussion. The person who posted off topic was very gracious and posted on ZOIA, and I 100% appreciate that. And like I said, if you don't see this video or don't, I'm not going to be angry, but it is, I think, better if you post an off-topic question that maybe pops into your mind while watching my video on ZOIA rather than in the comment section of these videos. So that aside, we're going to get into some more complicated examples of the sample and hold than the ones that I used in the last video. And there may be elements that I don't fully explain. It's the nature of the beast. This video can't be 4 hours long. I'm not trying to say I won't try to explain everything going on, but there's a lot going on. But again, this patch will be available on patch storage. You can go over it in your own time and try to figure out maybe if there's a connection I didn't explain what's going on there. The place we're going to begin is with a shift register or Turing machine. The idea of a shift register is actually, I think, pretty simple once you get your head wrapped around it, which is just that if you chain sample and holds together, these two are chained from the output of one sample and hold to the input of the next sample and hold, and so on and so on. These are all sample and holds here on this side of the page. you can pass information from one sample and hold to the next. So this is sort of, the idea of the sample and hold as a type of memory that I described in the first video. And that's really all that a shift register is. In a purely technical sense, this is the shift register part. There's some other stuff that gets combined with shift register, but a shift register is really just a way of moving data from one point to the next, to the next, to the next. And so the comparison that I make is a bucket brigade. In ye olden times, water would be passed from one fireman to the next fireman to the next fireman till it reached the fire. That's not a super common example anymore. So another one that I might use is like a game of telephone, except for without all the fun of degradation over time. You whisper in someone's ear and they whisper in someone's ear. And by the time it gets to the last person, you said, I'd like a ham sandwich, and they say, we're going to nuke Mars. But instead they'd say, I want a ham sandwich at the end, because we're dealing digitally. We don't have that sort of degradation. So what's going on here is just that these sample and holds are chained together. And the thing that makes this a Turing machine, or something that's useful in the realm of generating melody, is that the last sample and hold doesn't feed back into the first directly. Instead, its output goes into the first input of this in switch that I have here. And the other input of the in switch is just random values generated by this random module. And there is a probability gate here. That's the other element of this, is this switch and probability gate that is constantly deciding between those two, not constantly, clocked, actually, by clock deciding between those two options. So what we have here is a random module. It's being clocked by our clock source, our master clock source. That clock's also going into a multiplier. And the other input of this multiplier is actually what's going to determine the probability that something, that the random value is sampled into the sequence. So that goes into a comparator, and the comparator there basically checks every clock cycle whether or not the random amount is higher than this set probability. And if the random amount is higher than the comparator, because the random amount's going into the negative input of our comparator, the comparator stays low. But if it's higher, then the comparator goes high, and this controls our switch. So when it goes high, the shift register will introduce a new value, okay? And I understand this might sound a little esoteric, but we're going to listen to it for a second. I've got a beautiful synth voice set up once again. Right, we're hearing this repeat over and over again. But every now and then there's a new note added to the sequence. I'm going to just speed it up a little bit. And if I change this probability, if I set it to 0, our loop gets locked in place for forever. These 4 notes will just repeat and repeat and repeat because we've closed that loop, because there's no chance when the probability is set to 0 that this switch switches over to the second channel and a random value is introduced into the sequence. But we can also increase the probability turn it all the way to 100, every step will be just a random value. So that's a shift register. You may notice these value modules up here. What's happening there is that we're using one clock to sort of keep everything operating all together. You know, I talked in the first video about the importance of having everything in sync. This clock controls the triggering of these sample and holds, but it also controls this probability gate on a per step basis. So in order to make sure that the probability gate is reading the clock input at the right time, we need to make sure that we delay our clock before it reaches the sample and holds. So what I've done here is just chained 3 value modules in a row. I could have used the CV delay as well, but I used 3 value modules. And again, the whole idea there is to make sure that those operations are all happening at the same time. Pardon me. So that's the purpose of these value modules at the top. Now, this is just a pretty simple 4 sequence sample and hold, but I thought I'd be a little bit clever and do a different one. So this switch feeds from our 4th sample and hold, but then I added an additional chain here that goes to the output of an 8th sample and hold, and then finally an 11th sample and hold. And you can use a switch this way to sample from different outputs or loop different outputs. So I'm going to switch it over to the 11th output, and we'll hear, you know, the benefit there is that you have a longer melody line. So these permutations over time, you know, tend to have more complexity. They sound less like a repeating sequence and more like an evolving sequence. That's a subjective delineation there, but I think it's true that, you know, the longer you have and we could do interesting things at this point, like modulate this switch by an LFO or something like that, so that the length of the register changed over time, right? But you know, the real example here is just that sample and holds can or shift registers can sort of be any length you want. One thing I'll point out is that these the shift register is being quantized at its output. If we look at the output of the first sample and hold, that's the one that we're hearing. That goes into a multiplier, and then this is a way of defining the range of a random value that I've shown off in more detail in my video on bleeps and bloops. It's also in tips and tricks, but the basic idea here is that we add a high value to a multiplier, and then we subtract a low value in the range that we want to use from that same input, which gives us a range, and then we scale that using the low value, which is connected to the input of the quantizer along with the output of this multiplier. And then I've just got this going to an E pentatonic. So you can quantize values as they go into a shift register, and you can quantize them as they come out. The advantage of quantizing them as they come out is that you have more control over sort of immediate changes to the quantization, the key and scale. The disadvantage is that, you know, if I want to use the shift register to control multiple voices, because I'm just tapping one of these outputs at the moment, but I could send all of them to oscillators and we'd hear, instead of this melody, we'd hear chords evolving over time. You know, I have a patch called Shifting Around that uses this idea. If we wanted to do that, then it might be more CPU effective to quantize things as they go into the shift register rather than as they come out, because each one of those taps would require its own scaling system, like the one that's in operation here, and its own quantizer. So that's just, you know, I mean, you can do it either way. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. I've gravitated more toward quantizing the output of a shift register of late, because it does give you that flexibility if you want to change the key and scale, but both are, you know, fine. And then this just goes to our oscillator. It tells the oscillator what to play. I did want to show one other use of a shift register. As I said, they can be used in a bunch of different ways. So this is a 5-step shift register that looks like it needs, no, okay, it's fine. And what it is controlling is the panning amount of our little synthesizer voice. So, you know, I just wanted to show a different way that they could be applied other than just note selection. So here is our voice that you might remember. And then here it is with the panning shift register being applied to a panner that's at its output. So, you know, the advantage there is I have the shift register still running on 11 steps. The shift register for the panner is set to 5 steps. So they don't match up, right? You know, if it was 4 steps and 4 steps, you'd hear the same thing repeated over and over again. But here you get all of these variations, both as the shift registers themselves introduce new values, but also because their sequences are misaligned. So that's just another way to use the shift register. You know, I think panning in particular is a fun one. But you could use it for filtering, you could use it for LFO speed, whatever you wanted to. You know, it's just a way to introduce, I've described this in, you know, the live stream we did. It's a way of introducing variation over time with self-consistency, because, you know, again, you've got this sequence of notes or values that are repeated, but every so often they're changed just a little bit, or all the time they're changed just a little bit. It depends on what sort of probability you put on that, but it can have a very soothing melodic sense while also giving you a sense of something that is self-consistent, but also evolving and changing. So it's, you know, a way to introduce, I think, very pleasingly variation over time. And that's the shift register. So the next patch is, or patchlet, is a sequencer that you can, oh, sequencer is being quiet. That that you can use a keyboard module, or again, this could be replaced with a MIDI note in, or whatever you wanted to. You could step sequence from an external input. So here we've got this little keyboard playing these little sounds. And if I press this button down here, which I've called record, it does a couple of different things. Make this a little... So, the idea here is that you play in 8 notes. I should also point out that you can edit it on the fly too. But the idea here is that you play in 8 notes, and then a sequence begins playing based on those 8 notes. And it could be longer than 8 notes. I just chose 8 notes because I wanted to be able to quickly demonstrate it. So let's go through what's happening here. The first thing to note is that we've once again got a shift register. This is not a Turing machine. There's no probability involved in it. It is, in fact, a closed system under the right circumstances. And we've got a switch here. The switch has 3 different channels, okay? The first channel is connected to the output of our keyboard module, the note output. On one channel, or on one of the switches, there are 2 switches here that run in parallel. One controls gates, and one controls gates, one controls pitch. So the other goes to the gate input of our keyboard. When this keyboard is on channel 0, the output, which goes to our sample and holds, will trigger them to record what we play into their memory. Okay, so that's the first step. That's what's happening when our little record button is on. The logic used here is that I'm inverting the output of this push button. So actually when it's off, it sends a high signal, and the high signal will not direct the keyboard to our sample and holds. So when it's not recording, we're just hearing a direct connection to the synth voice that I've created for this part of the patching. So basically it's the same idea as the shift register, except for instead of random values, we're getting values that are input by a keyboard instead. And then they just pass these down the line. And once again, we have an output from one of our sample and holds. It should go somewhere. Oh, right. That goes to our switch, and the switch goes to our oscillator that we're using, or rather a sample and hold that we're using in our synth voice to capture what note we're on at that moment. And the reason that it does that is so that when you send a note from the keyboard while the sequence is playing, it isn't picked up until the next step in the sequence, right? So it doesn't just automatically override what's playing, it'll override what's next sequentially, right? That's why there's a sample and hold used here. But so this pitch switch, we would call it, I guess, goes to the sample and hold. And then we've got this gate switch, and it goes to the sample and hold too. No. What did I do there? Yeah. But it also goes to the ADSR of our synth voice to trigger the sound to be generated. So when I'm just playing this, our switch sends the note and gate directly to our synth voice. When I press this button, record, the switch is sent back to channel 1. And these outputs connect to our sample and hold, and we can play something into the sample and holds. This also works as a pause or mute, I guess. So anyhow, once we played in those 8 notes, it switches to channel 2. And this is what loops the output of the sample and hold back into the input of the sample and holds. And then our clock, this LFO, is fed into the trigger inputs of the sample and hold. So they just start passing these notes that are held in their memory down the line. So that's the basic premise of how it works. The switching is a little bit complicated, and I know I'm not explaining it quite as well as I should, but you can dive into it. I'm giving you sort of some guidelines, at least. The other thing that's happening in this patch is that there's a counter, and the counter is keeping track of how many notes have been played into the sample and hold buffer, so that when you play 8 notes in, it switches from the manual input to that. You know, if you noticed when I was playing, it switched from me playing the notes in, and once I reached 8 notes, it switched over to automatically playing those notes. The way that that works is that I've got a sample and hold counter, kind of like the incrementer example that I used in the first video. And it is being fed by its own output, and then also this value. And the reason the value is what it is because I'm trying to get it to pass the negative input of this comparator. So this value is determined by the number of times it needs to count to do that, right? So if you wanted to have a longer sequence, you'd want to have a smaller value that's incremented. And this is, you'll see this example in tips and tricks when I talk about samplers controlling switches, or I'm sorry, sequencers controlling switches. the way that you determine this value is by taking the number of steps you want, the number of channels you want, the number of whatever you want, and dividing it 1 by the number below it. So this is an approximation of the value of 1 divided by 8 minus 1, as in 7. So 1 divided by 7 gives us the step distance, because 0 is our first step and 1 is our last step. So we're trying to count from 0 to 1. So it's not, it wouldn't be the division of 8 because we're starting from 0 as a step. That's step 1. So we want to count up 7 more times to reach a total of 8 steps or 8 counts. Again, I know that sounds a little bit confusing, but the thing to keep in mind here is that each time that the keyboard is pressed, the sample and hold is triggered, and when it does, it counts up in this amount. And when it reaches 8, it stops counting because it can't go higher than 1. It essentially reaches 1, but this comparator goes high, and the comparator switches these switches to channel 2, which is the channel where everything is automated. So I'll just give the example one more time. We'll press record. And that's the basic premise of a step sequence that you can use a keyboard module or a MIDI note in module to enter values into. The real basic principle that I want you to grasp here is that the sample and holds are being used once again to form a sort of memory. But differently than the shift register here, the memory is composed of an external input. And that external input is just being recorded by the sample and holds and then stepped through in a sequential manner. So that's our sequencer that uses an external source. And then the rest of this patch is just the voice for that sequencer. I'm going to mute it again. All of these little voices that I have a push button to mute them on the page. I actually realized as I was making editing the first video that I'd use stomp switches, and stomp switches are really beneficial in the world of ZOIA because it's one thing that you can, press on the module that won't focus on that element, right? So you can look at the output of something and press a stomp switch to see what might be happening based on what the stomp switch is connected to. That's really useful, especially when you're trying to demonstrate something, but it's not something that's available in Eurobureau. So for this video, I'm trying to be a little bit more conscientious about that. So I know I rushed over this sample and hold sort of sequencer thing, but it really is, once you start, like getting your mind wrapped around it, it's just a matter of like this idea of a sample and hold chained together, being able to create a sort of memory buffer. And then the rest is just logic to make it work the way that you want it to work. So you could have, elaborations on this that are much more sophisticated based on your needs. And again, I'll point out, you can have many more steps than 8. 8 was just easy to demonstrate. You could chain together as many sample and holds as the memory would allow you to. You could create some sort of readout that showed what step was playing. You'll see that in the next example. For this one, I didn't want to get into that. You could have a parallel string of sample and holds to do things like record rests and that sort of thing. So you could, put gates or not gates into those sample and holds and then multiply them by some clock source to determine whether or not there was a rest or not on that step. So there are a lot of ways you could use these. I'm just showing off this pretty simple one right now. And you don't have to have this counter thing. I just thought it'd be neat, where it automatically switches over. The advantage there is that I don't have to keep track of how many notes I've entered or whatever. It lets me know because it just starts playing So that is the sequencer with an external input example. And next we're going to move on to our last example, which is a sequencer that goes up, down, left, right, every which way, but loose, except for it kind of goes loose. So we're on to the third example in this video, which is a sequencer that plays forward, backward, every which way you want. Turn on the voice here. Where did I put the push button for that? This makes me feel dumb. It's a little hard to see these buttons from an angle in this light. So what I've got here is a 16-step sequence, and it has a number of different play modes. Right now it's in the stochastic mode, which is a drum clock, but it can play forward, backward, pendulum, forward and backward. Our drum clock again, stochastic, and then I can play random. Let's mute that again. So there's a lot to unpack in this example, but the basic premise that I want you to keep in mind is that all of them involve the idea of a sample and hold as a counter, right? As a thing that can count up values. So what's happening here, I'll walk through the simplest version, which is just a forward sequence in as much detail as I can. So what happens here is that we've got a value. Let me turn it back to the forward sequencing example so that we can actually see this in action. So what we've got here is a value, right? And that value is set by this in switch, but the actual in switch input is set by this value module down here, which we're inverting. and that goes into the second input of our in switch for when we want to count backward. So we can count forward, we can count backward, depending on the position of this in switch. But the in switch goes to a multiplier here, as does the output of the sample and hold. And basically what the sample and hold is doing is, like in the example of the, recordable sequencer, step sequencer, it's counting up to 1 in discrete steps. So that's what our value is based on. Since we have a 16-step sequencer, once again, we're counting up in steps of 1 divided by 15. So the benefit there is that it counts up to 1. And once it reaches 1, we have the output going into this comparator. And the complement to a sample and hold being used as a counter is a comparator, because a comparator can be used to reset the sample and hold, for instance. That's what's happening here. Once it reaches a certain value, it can be used to sort of contain the sample and hold and keep it in its place. So whenever this reaches 1, it becomes higher than our comparator's positive input. And I actually have the comparator's positive input tied to a value module here, because it gets used in, to a steps module here. And the steps module is set to 16 steps. And a value module informs that. And this value module is being used to set the step number for the overall patch. So I can limit the number of steps that we use to that way. If we go back to our example, we can see our sequencer resetting. And the steps module just sort of quantizes that output to something that is appropriate to the number of steps that we want out of 16. So that's why the step count is set to 16. It's dividing that range between 0 and 1 into 16 discrete zones, like we've talked about before with counting up to certain numbers. So I'm going to set that back to 1. And then this is connected at, you'll notice, just a little bit less than 100%, so that it's a little bit smaller than what the output of the sample and hold should be when it counts up to the appropriate number. This is then connected to our inputs, the one from the in switch, our increment amount, and then the output of the sample and hold through a multiplier. So when it reaches 1, the output of the sample and hold, or of the comparator, goes low, and it feeds the sample and hold a value of 0 to reset the counting. And that's the basic idea there. You then connect this to a switch. And what we've got here, if I remove these are just overlapping value modules. So they're connected to the individual steps of the switch. But, we can change these. It's a little bit confusing. I put in a light thing because I thought it'd be cool, but it's also occasionally a little confusing. We can change the steps using those value modules. But they're ultimately connected to this switch, and the switch then, feeds our sample and hold that controls our oscillator. Again, we have a sample and hold controlling the oscillator because in order to get this little light show, I have to send values to the inputs of the value modules. I do that on this page. And everything sort of has to be set up in such a way so that we don't just send values of 1 to the oscillator. We want to have it capture that note, and then immediately after it captures that note value, the sample and hold that is connected to the oscillator captures that note value, and then a value of 1 is set to each of these value modules to get our little light show going on. But that's the basic principle. So it's just functioning as a counter, and as it counts through those values, it changes the channel of the switch. So if we look at the output of our switch, we're going through all of these different channels. And you may notice some additional stuff here. This is, again, we've talked a lot about timing. So in this case, I wanted to slow down the output of the sample and hold that's functioning as a counter, this sample and hold, so that it reached this switch that is directing the values to the value modules to cause them to light up, to be a little bit slower than this switch, so that we could sample that switch's output and then the light would light up. So this is not a perfectly accurate representation of what note's playing. It's off by like 3 milliseconds. Sorry, you know. But I just thought that'd be a nice feature to throw in and also demonstrate. So again, you know, this is a matter of getting the timing right so that the output of this switch can be sampled by the sample and hold that controls our voice, so that it doesn't sample 1, it samples the note that we want to use. Okay, so the way that I'll just switch versions. The way that the negative version works is, if we look at our output, it just counts down from 1, okay? And once it reaches, you know, again, we have a comparator that's being used to drop low once the output of our sample and hold drops below. Again, we've got an attenuated version of our value, so that the comparator only drops low once this output of the sample and hold drops below what would be the second step, right? When it drops to 0, the comparator goes, oh, time to reset everything. So when that happens, two things occur. One is that, once again, our multiplier goes low, but we've also got a comparator that is, well, a couple of things are happening there. There's a comparator that is controlled by the output of this. So when this goes high, this comparator, or when this goes low, this comparator goes high. This comparator is basically just inverting that. And then we've got the output of that comparator going into our switch, and that goes to the sample and hold. So it samples a value of 1, right? Because once we get to 0, we want to reset back to 1 so that it can count down again. And so those are the two systems at work. For up and down, let's see it counting down now. For the pendulum action, keep forgetting where I put this. For the pendulum action, we basically got it so that it's switching the inputs and I should say that this switch determines which of these comparators goes to the multiplier. I forgot to mention that. But we don't have that connection to the input of the sample and hold when this comparator reaches 0, because we don't want to set it back to 1. What we want to do is flip these switches around. So the way that we do that is that we've got comparators connected to the output of the other two comparators to invert them. So what that does is switch around this flip-flop. And the flip-flop is always flipping around, but it only gets connected to these switches during the pendulum action. And in fact, I should point out that we've got radio buttons here. And what the radio buttons are doing is controlling a value of 1 that's being sent to various places. So when the forward is selected, that 1 is actually sent nowhere because we want every one of these channels to be on channel 1. So we don't want anything really happening then. But when we switch to backwards, we can look at the output 2 of our switch, and it's switching all of these switches to their second channel. So we've got our negative value being sent to the multiplier, and we've got this inversion of our comparator being sent to the sample and holds input, and we've got this comparator being used to control the multiplier in the feedback loop to reset it to 0. So when we're counting backwards, this switch goes to different places. The pendulum, you'll note, we don't send this to the multiplier, like I said, so it's back on channel 0. And then we're connecting the output of this flip-flop to the inputs of these two switches. So essentially, when it reaches 0 or 1, it flips back and forth and counts up or down, okay? We've got a stochastic mode, and the stochastic mode, if we look at where its output goes, once again, none of these are connected to the switches. Instead, we've got another probability gate here, right? We've got a random module that's being clocked by our clock. The clock goes into the input of the random module. Clock, by clock, I mean the LFO that we're using. Actually, sorry, I apologize. It's an inversion of the LFO that we're using. Clocks this, and I just did that because I wanted to have this, it was a timing issue. You could also send the LFO through a delay, but I didn't want to figure out the delay. So I just inverted the clock so that it wasn't, it kept missing the signal because this would be triggered before the sample and hold was ready to sample. So instead I just said, well, if I invert it, it should be fine, and it was fine. It's not the most sophisticated way to explain that, but you know, sometimes, again, with sample and holds, timing is sort of everything. So timing was pretty crucial here as well. So that goes to this random module and a multiplier. And we've got, I put in a value module here to set the step back probability. And again, we've got this comparator configuration. So it's figuring out whether it goes high or low, and that controls all of these different switches, right? Because it might count forward or backward, it might need to be reset. And then the output of our radio button switch goes to the input of the multiplier on that, because if the multiplier on this is set to 0, then this comparator won't do anything and won't affect these switches. So we can keep it connected even when other modes are active, as long as this multiplier is set to 0. And I'll just point out, let me unmute my little synth voice again. When you set this amount above 0.5, it actually starts moving mostly backwards because this comparator is going high more often, and the high position for all of these switches is one where it counts backwards. So right now, sometimes it moves forward a little bit, sometimes, but mostly it moves backward. If we switch that around, it mostly moves forward, but sometimes it moves backward. So I always thought that was neat, just because you can have, I mean, you could think of this as a forward-backward control in some ways, because if it's set to 100%, it'll move only forward, and if it's set to 1% or 0%, it'll only move forward. So, you know, that's the stochastic mode. And then the random mode takes a random value and it sends it into a multiplier. Right now, that multiplier is determined by the step count. So if I lower this, it'll move randomly between fewer values. So the step count still applies. That's why that's one part of the multiplier. The other part is our output from our switch. And this multiplier, this other multiplier that's this is, I'm sorry, I got confused a little bit earlier when I talked about this comparator that goes to the input of our multiplier, of our sample and hold. I forgot I sent it through a multiplier so that it actually resets to the right value. So, you know, if you were doing all 16 steps, you would want to have it count down from 1. But if you're doing 10 steps or whatever, you want it to count down from a different value than 1. And when the random module is sent to the sample and hold, it samples it on each step. The thing to keep in mind here is that the multiplier is kept at 0 so that it doesn't feed back into itself. You just get these random values between our note range. So we've got all these different playback modes. But really the concept that I want to get across here is that if you want to create this type of sequencer, and look, there are other examples of forwards and backwards sequencer tutorials, but they just switch between a track that's sequenced in one direction and one sequenced in the other one. The difference here is that when I change these modes, it changes on that step. So if I'm moving forward, it won't. If I'm moving forward and I press the button on this step, it'll start moving backward from that step. But if you have just inversely programmed sequencers, it would actually jump to this step and would sound quite jarring. So this might seem a little bit more complicated, and maybe for your use case it's too complicated, but I think the basic idea is just that we're using a sample and hold to count stuff, and that's not too complicated. And then we're using different logic to make it count in different ways, depending on which mode we want to use. So, you know, that's the sequencer that can move in whichever direction you want it to. I used a 16-step example, and you might be thinking, well, that's the total number of inputs I can have for a switch. And that's accurate, but you could easily expand this to much larger numbers, because you could have the sample and hold, for instance, whenever one of these comparators was met, you could have another sample and hold that counted and controlled another switch, that the output of the first switch and then a subsequent switch were fed to them. Both of them could be using the same sample and hold to count from. So, you know, if you had it as 1, 2, 3, 4 on one, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. If you switch between those, you actually have 8 steps, right? So expanding it from 16 to 32 to a bunch of steps is actually pretty easy, relatively speaking. I mean, I think that the bigger hurdle is just getting this mechanism set up. And then it's just, you know, I mean, you have a bunch of indications of when the sample and hold reaches the last number in its count, or the first number in its count. And with that, you can switch between different outputs of switches. So you could set up more and more switches, you know, to be switched between. It's a lot of switching in there. So again, you know, this is, I understand, a pretty complicated thing, but most of it is just logic to make sure that the sample and hold counts up or down at the right time. And then the rest is just showy crap. I mean, I didn't have to put in this little thing where it followed the sequence. That makes everything just slightly more complicated. You don't have to do that either, or you could do it instead of having it use the value modules. I was doing that to save space, but you could have a row of pixels, you know, that have nothing to do with the module, the value modules for node entry. And you may also be wondering, well, okay, can I use these features with the step record features? And yes, you can combine those two as well. I may try and get a patch out that does that. I thought about putting that together, but it was just sort of like, at that point, let's take a pretty complicated patching example and another pretty complicated patching example and smush them together. Just didn't seem like the best way to approach this video, that I'm sure is gonna not be like entirely intelligible no matter what my best efforts are. But, you know, again, the core of all of these is just, you know, looking at what a sample and hold can do and expanding on that, right? So it can, you know, hold different values in its memory, and you can chain those together to form step recorders and shift registers, and it can count up. And when you combine that with a switch, then you can move through the switch's inputs, and suddenly you have a sequencer. And in fact, I imagine this is probably how the first sequencers work. They counted up some voltage that caused a switch to move between different potentiometer. You know, if you look on the front page, it'd be like, or on the control panel, there'd be like 8 knobs, right? And I'm guessing the way that the first sequencers worked was with a voltage that would just count, and at different thresholds, a different potentiometer would be connected to the output. So, you know, my hope here is that, first of all, these things are useful and you're getting a lot out of it, but also that you start to see some of the potential of the sample and hold as this sort of mechanism for, you know, ways to store memory, as ways to keep track of things. I mean, that's really what the counting is about. It's about keeping track of things. It's about, you know, knowing how many steps it takes to cycle a switch through whatever the switch is doing. So that is the second installment in this video series. The third one, like I said, will be out in about a week or so. It sort of depends on some other stuff that I would like to get done. And I realize that, you know, maybe as expected, this more complicated patching stuff I didn't explain as well as might be ideal, but I do encourage you to download the patches and look through them. I'll have some patch notes, but you know, the patches, with the exception of this one area, I tried to keep things from overlapping or anything like that. And this was just a matter of, I mean, if this was how I was doing this for my own patch, I definitely overlap these value modules, because I think they look better. It's more space efficient. And I just, you know, I didn't want to have to show this switch on one page, these value modules on another one. But, you know, you can use those to change the notes of the sequence around. And yeah, let's stop it there. Have a good day.